The thought process that by being in the rural environment, you're safe from any government overreach might be flawed. So in this video, we're going to talk about why you need to prepare now for rural population containment. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about why you need to prepare for rural population containment, and you need to understand that the training is already out there for authorities in your area to be able to quarantine large populations in rural environments. That is all being planned for now, and it was planned for before even the events of last year occurred. And these are things that we need to talk about so that if you live in a rural environment, you can understand that just because you're there doesn't mean you're immune to whatever the government can decide to try to do in your area at some point in time. And if you're preparing to deal with these consequences that could occur during SHTF scenarios, then hit the subscribe button below, because I'm trying to bring this information to you when I receive it. And I do want to talk about some of the differences of the hype around said training, as well as exactly what it's for, okay? So the RDPC, or the Rural Domestic Preparedness Consortium, was created in 2004 by Congress. And it's basically a provider of DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, certified training courses for emergency responders in rural areas where there's different challenges in trying to respond to an emergency when there isn't a extremely tight area like an urban environment where everything is easily accessible. Everything is spaced out, everything's far apart. There aren't fire hydrants on every street. There's a lot of other things that go into planning for emergencies in a rural environment. So that's the point of the RDPC, okay? And their whole point is just providing training for small, rural, or tribal emergency responders. So you can see that there is a very niche application for this consortium that is being put together to help train these people on how to deal with problems. Now, the interesting part about the course that they're offering right now is that it's specific to isolation and quarantine for rural areas, especially large areas of a rural population. And that is something that we at least have to consider as being a risk during SHTF. The training's out there and the emergency responders are being told exactly how to handle these situations, so it does not mean that you and I are both immune from being contained during some kind of an incident, whether or not we like it or whether or not we feel like it should happen in our area. So I wanted to bring this to your attention. This course is NGT 433, Isolation and Quarantine for Rural Communities, and it's a course that was created in August of 2019. So that's interesting, I would say the least, but it is something that's out there and people are able to get training courses on now as long as they meet prerequisites, okay? And I will put information about this in the description as well as in the pinned comment, so you guys can check it out and just have a better understanding of what this exact training course is for. But it's broken down into 5 modules, and I did take some notes, so I will be doing a little bit of reading here just to make sure I touch base on everything. Now, the hype and everything around this that's being put out there on the internet is that this is, of course, the way that they're going to control and contain us out in the rural environments, and they're targeting us specifically due to a lack of certain medical resources that are being distributed in said rural environments, and the fact that it's just one of those things that people have that idea in mind that because you're out in the countryside, you won't be affected by things that people in an urban environment will be. But this training should tell you and open up your eyes to the idea that they're prepared for that as well, and they know that it's something they may have to do at some point in time. So I don't think there's necessarily anything to freak out about right this second based on this training, and it's not necessarily targeting anybody specifically, but the timing of its creation, August 2019, and the fact that it's based on something that was recently a big problem for everybody, and the idea that it's out there in the sense of, okay, how do we isolate and contain rural environments and populations, even though generally those are the areas that are least affected by said communicable diseases? Well, here we are. This is exactly what's being put out there, and as prepared people, we need to be at least aware of what the plan is so we can react to it more appropriately when this time comes, okay? So, this is a management level 8-hour course that provides knowledge necessary to begin planning for isolation and quarantine of large areas of a rural population, okay? And it's broken up in these 5 training modules, and this is where you can gain some information about what their thoughts are and what their plans are, but without taking the course, we don't know exactly what's in it. So here's the 5 modules that are in the course, and this should give you at least something to consider and think about, especially if you're in a rural environment. And if you're not and you're in an urban environment, you should at least pay attention, because this could all be happening if you decide to bug out and head for the hills, and then you run into a quarantine or you run into a containment center, because it's all happening out there as well. And this might change your plans based on where you can go during an emergency like this one, okay? So, number 1 module is Intro to Isolation and Quarantine, the difference between isolation, quarantine, the triggers of said isolation and quarantine, and the challenges in pulling one off. So that's module 1, okay? Module 2 is the legal and ethical issues of isolation and quarantine, okay? So obviously there's a lot of legal and ethical issues with trying to isolate and quarantine a large population of people in a rural environment, especially people who are much more acclimated to moving about freely on their own property or throughout their area. And this is where they're trying to get fed, state, and local authorities regarding isolation and quarantine responses covered, in the sense of how they're going to execute the due process of law during said scenario, and whether or not due process even exists. This is something that we don't have information on unless we're in the course. So this is just something else to consider, okay? Number 3 is rules and responsibilities during isolation and quarantine. Or not rules, roles. So, roles and responsibilities. What does that mean? Well, roles and responsibilities of the entire community will be reviewed, and communication strategies will also be covered. So, the entire community is going to receive roles and responsibilities, because in smaller towns and in rural areas, you have to rely on the people that are there, which are generally not many. So you might just be the local dentist, but you might have a role and responsibility that this training course has given you that you might not even be aware of until this situation occurs. And you might not have the ability to operate freely or operate or react in a manner that you approve of, because this committee has basically put together a situation where you already have a job to do that you don't even know exists. Something to consider, okay? Especially if you have some level of importance in the sense of your skill for your community. If you're in medical, or if you are able to do things like construction, so they know they can utilize you to do what's in the next module, which is number 4, communication strategies for isolation and quarantine response, okay? And this is about the structures and strategies that need to be implemented in order to maintain consistent communication throughout some kind of an incident. So obviously people who are, engineers are capable of putting together maybe mobile equipment for being able to have communications online. That's all something that's going to be considered as well. Other things to keep in mind, okay? And then the 5th module is the emergency response activity during isolation and quarantine. So roles and responsibilities for public health, public safety, private sector, and volunteer groups for the entire community response. So they have roles and responsibilities figured out for the private sector and for the volunteer groups already. Whether or not they even know that they're being targeted with these roles and responsibilities, and whether or not they even know this is something they've already signed up for, this plan is already in place to basically put those roles and responsibilities out there once an incident occurs, okay? I doubt you're gonna get a letter in the mail that's gonna tell you, hey, just so you know, when something like this happens, you're actually gonna be in charge of taping off all the windows and doors at the hospital. Like, this is not something that is being broadcast out there for us to have full knowledge on, but this is a training module that people can access if they have the right prerequisites and if they're in the right profession that would allow them to access said training. So, this is what I wanted to bring to your attention. Just because you live in a countryside setting and just because you're in the rural environment does not mean you're protected from government overreach or government containment or quarantines or isolations of any kind during an SHTF scenario, especially one that's worried about infectious disease. And obviously, they're already planning for having to deal with that here in the future. And yes, there's a lot of different rabbit holes you can go down to talk about why this might be happening or what their plans are or what the whole concept behind it is. But the one thing that this whole training module should show you is that things are already in place to be handled in a certain manner if something was to happen. And you're not just safe sitting out here in the countryside. They are coming for you. They're coming for us when it comes to anything they decide is going to be a threat that they have to isolate or quarantine. And this is exactly what this training is for. And I wanted to bring it to your attention because it's one more example as the fact that we aren't always in control of what happens to us, no matter where we are. And no matter where you prepare or where you're trying to be better prepared for what could happen, things can happen to you that are outside of your control. And you need to do the best you can to be ready for them ahead of time. And learning about things like this training module is a good way for you to kind of get some ideas about what they might try to do so that you can react to it more appropriately. And that's why I'm bringing it to your attention. So if you have anything else to talk about, how we need to prepare for rural population containment, leave it in the comments below. This is something that a lot of people try to move past and just say, all right, I live in the country now, nothing to worry about. All those city dwellers are going to have to deal with the government and all the crazy martial law and stuff when this all happens. But it's not just them. And there are plans being put in place right now that could easily put us in a similar situation. So I want to hear what your thoughts are on it. And if you have anything else for me at all, magicprepper.com is always a good bet. But that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.